existing use. I mean, what we're really talking about is going in and reallocating water from existing uses, saying, you know, either domestic or ag or what have you, you don't need that water and we're going to reallocate it. For those folks who've been on a lot of the San Joaquin rivers, at least, predation projects and habitat projects are certainly much less contentious than water right proceedings of taking a water right or curtailing a water right for a different use. So perhaps there could be more success just in looking at how contentious and regulatory process is. Say that again? Oh, yeah, I'm on my last point. Yep. Okay, sorry, I'm almost done. And then the last part is just that it's an overwhelming amount of information, right? That matrix and the information that you would need to collect to go through all of these steps to do the public trust weighing and balancing and information is fairly overwhelming. And the only solution that we would have on that is that a lot of stakeholder, to Dee Dee's point, just early and often stakeholder input. I know the SJTA members are certainly willing to develop checklists like they do in the FERC process and really make good focused decisions at the top of that matrix to get to more solid decisions at the bottom. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks. There's a lot in both your presentations that's about the later weighing and balancing of things. I understand your desire to put it out there, that's fine, but I'd like to focus on the science issues that we're talking about today. It's not to say those are irrelevant to context, but I would like us to focus on that piece. And Doug, I just wasn't clear in what you said. I noted the issues where you had concern with Aloha or even a hybrid, and you talked about IFAM and maybe sticking with something that's more known, and or maybe tell me if I'm wrong. I heard implicit in that a wholesale switch to something new concerned you, so maybe you should do it in parallel or test it out in parallel, or are you happy with IFAM? You didn't come out and say that you thought it was just fine. So can you just give a little more on that subject of how we set flow criteria and what we should be thinking about in that piece? Because you said a lot before and a lot after, that perfectly valid point of view, but I really want to focus on what I thought I heard you say about the question that we're looking at today, which is this report.
Yep. And I guess what I'm unclear of is why, how we got to the point where we decided that we're going to move away from IFIM when it does so much time, effort, resources, so many scientists. You know, when we use it in these FERC processes, like I said, that are so contentious and stakeholder driven and so expensive, and it seems like it has become the standard methodology. And when we've got a good baseline of those studies in the Central Valley, to bring in a new methodology that I'm fairly unfamiliar with, other than going back and reviewing 20 reports, a methodology that is not necessarily been geared towards, I've seen it used on trout, but not salmon. I haven't seen it used in environments such as the Central Valley of California. You know, it is a unique environment, and I don't even know that it's been used in the Pacific Northwest as well. As we heard, you know, this is from, I believe it was developed in Texas and Florida. So bringing this technique into the Central Valley and hoping that it's scientifically defensible right out of the gate. You know, we're talking about flow issues. I don't know that there's anything that's more contestable in the Central Valley than setting flow criteria. And to bring in a new methodology, even though it's a hybrid, you're going to borrow pieces from IFIM and pieces from Aloha. It does seem that it's in some respects, for me, from my perspective, it's a little counterintuitive. And if we were going to do it, it seems like the way to do it would be to come in and you know, test it, to set up a test.
Isn't the point, I just want to go back to your own words about IFAM being very expensive and time intensive, and so I think the opportunities we should always be open to is there a cheaper, faster way to do something? And then the question becomes the question of, is it scientifically defensible, or secondarily, getting to some of the things you're saying, how would we test it out to feel comfortable? So
Yeah.
we're not talking about, we're talking about this moment in time, but we're also talking about looking towards the future. I mean, and
Yeah.
we can argue about the importance of flow and whether it's a little box and you can set it up, but you know, we are directed to do flow criteria, and reasonable minds differ on the importance of flow, as you all know from being through
Yeah.
tons of hearings we have had and will discuss in other hearings. So for me, the issue is, what's most helpful is, how do we remain open and think about, if there's a better way to do it, we should think about it
Yeah.
because of the expense. And so the question becomes, is it a better way, and how would we know?
I agree, but I think in that process, when you look at those questions, then you get into a 10-year process to determine if it is better. That's my worry. A typical IFIM, you could do the field work for an IFIM, PABSIM, RHABSIM, HECRAS, whatever you want to use as the foundation. You could do that field work in a year. Typically, because it's stakeholder driven, you're looking at 2 to 3 years, and as noted, they are typically species specific, but they're species specific because our management is so species specific. We could do IFIM for 10 or 20 different studies, and that's been done before. It's just, we've sat through testimony in previous hearings on flow and outmigrant survival, and you see these PhD statisticians with these models and all these different opinions, and most of it goes over my head, and it just makes my head spin, and it's very difficult to get scientists to agree to anything, but it seems like the one positive that we have in flow and setting flow criteria is that we've got a long-standing track record, not only in California but along the West Coast, from these FERC studies using IFIM or using the IFIM approach.
Right. I'll open it to other questions. I'm going to start on this side this time.
I'm just going to repeat to some extent what the question that Felicia was asking, because if we could afford and had the time, 100 years probably, to do 178 rivers over the state of California using IFIM,
Yeah.
I mean, I assume we'd do it. But we don't have that.
Yeah.
So are we going to do nothing except where there's FERC money, where there are people who have plenty of money because of FERC, because of hydropower, and ignore everything else?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of that's where we are.
I understand.
And I understand where you are. And so the question is, help us here figure out where we should be doing some tests that might give us some good information to decide how to move forward in a
Yeah.
more cost-effective way. Help
Okay.
us a little bit.
Yeah, well, and the cost factor, I don't know that there's, if you're asking me for my opinion on where I would save money, I wouldn't be looking to save money when we're setting flow criteria. Because all we're going to do, if we come up with this cookie cutter cheap approach, it's going to end up in the court systems, and it's going to take forever, and it's going to be contested. And if there's one thing that we want to buy the Cadillac version on, it would be the studies to set flow criteria. That would be my perspective, and I think that's why FERC costs so much. And the timeliness, I think that FERC and IFIM studies can be timely. And my main concern here is by bringing in a new approach, a hybrid approach that's been untested, that hasn't been used on salmon, hasn't been used in the Central Valley and these types of streams, that we think it's going to be timely, we think it's going to be cost effective, but it's going to be the exact opposite. That's my concern. I don't know that there's a cheap way. If there was a cheap way of doing this, I think that it would have been developed a while ago, because the people that are paying for the relicensing studies don't like paying 10, 20, $30 million. So, I think they would have looked for more efficient or effective ways of doing it, but I don't know that there are any, unfortunately. So I really don't have an answer for you, or I wish I had a better alternative, but I just don't think there's a silver bullet for this issue. And again, I go back to what's the single most, I've been doing this for 20 years, and the single most contested issue in the Central Valley is flows and the need for flows to improve Chinook. And when we get back to that sense of urgency, I showed you the graph with the fall run Chinook salmon. We've had more fish in 2013 compact to the system than in the 40 years between, was it 1960 and 1999. So I don't think there's this critical extinction threat, at least for
Can
fall
I
run
just
Chinook
stop you?
salmon.
There are a lot of fish and a lot of issues, and so let's stick on the methods. And I'm
Okay.
also cutting you off because there are long answers, and I want to get to other speakers. No disrespect intended,
Okay,
because
so-
you were repeating yourself. Other questions?
Well, that was along the lines, I would just reiterate, please help us out, because I think I am hearing you say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But it is broke. They're not cost effective. IFIM is not cost effective, and it's not timely. So anything you can do in your comments to really hone in on ways to make it more cost effective. I'm following what you're saying on the concerns, because each system is different. And if you look, I mean, I'm thinking the same thing about Florida and Texas, about salmon and different ecosystems and terrain and all that are not similar at all to what we have here. But what sort of similarities do we have within our systems that have already been studied that could somehow be incorporated into a shortened version? I think that we don't want to have shortcuts, because then I don't think a shortcut that raises questions about scientific defensibility is going to help us, because then we're going to have, as you say,
Yeah.
a big outcry by stakeholder communities. But at the same time, like Fran said, we got to get moving on this quickly. So what can we do to use the existing approaches to fix what seems to be broken of the existing system on cost effectiveness and timeliness?
Okay, those are good points, and we will try and address that in our upcoming written comments.
Great. And then the last question that I have, and I know we're not here to talk about biological objectives, but there's a lot of good thinking that's going on in the area of biological objectives. And I think that was the point that you were making, Valerie, about, other approaches. So whatever we use, whatever model we use, I'd like to hear your thoughts about how it could fit in with biological objectives. So not flow for flow's sake, but flow and other mechanisms that could be used to address biological objectives.
Questions on this?
Good. Yeah, this is just a kind of a reiteration as well. Looking at the whole task of extrapolating, and I'm familiar with it in different settings. So I really respect that point, and it'll be good to hear more specifics, because you can stratify systems and say, these, like you pointed out, the clear one, the tributaries with dams versus not. That's a good example of not being able to extrapolate.
Yeah.
So some insight based on the IFIM studies conducted to date, because that's a lot of investment, right? Societally, we've really paid a lot for that information. To the extent we can use it, leverage it in coming up with defensible approaches, that will be really helpful to us,
Yep.
I think.
I think you guys raised some good points, and as we go back to the drawing board and prepare our comments, we'll focus on that, how we could perhaps build upon what we have and make it efficient and timely, even though, again, those are my two concerns.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
much.
So much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks. We'll look forward to the comments. I want to ask Dr. Dom to come back, though. You guys can. I just want to, did you, before we keep moving on, because there will no doubt be all kinds of issues raised through the public comment, do you want to put in context, or respond is too strong a word, I don't want to get into an argument, but just help illuminate the issue and how we should be thinking about the distinctions between, say, whatever's been learned in a Florida or Texas context, or a, I want to say a non-salmon context, because there are other fish involved in this than salmon, and there are many different runs of salmon, that whole ecosystem terrain bucket of things. Just how should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, briefly, let me make just a couple comments. First of all, the IFIM method has been used for 25, 30 years. And there's a very nice review paper on the use of that method by Jeff Petz that was published in 2009. I strongly recommend you look at that. In addition, Rebecca Tharm has looked at these methodologies all over the world, and classifying IFIM or some other method is really a difficult thing because there's just nuances on how the methods are applied. Aloha is new. It's 2010. It's an attempt to cut across this issue of whether you can more broadly apply some of the information, and it's very dependent on these flow ecology relationships. It's a very valid point that it was basically, the seminal paper was in 2010. Some of the critiques that were just shown to you on a slide are by the people working with Leroy Poff developing the method. They've gone out and tested it. So Angela Arthington in Australia has tested the method. How well does it work in Australia? Oregon is actively testing the method. How well does it work in Oregon? The method was developed in Colorado. Leroy Poff is from Colorado State University, and it's actually was developed for trout species and other fishes. I mean, and again, it's not just a single species. It's looking at a system approach to these things. So, it is a new method that needs some vetting, some significant vetting. But I don't think our report said it's an either-or situation. Let's blend some of the positive attributes of both of these methods and use that going forward. And certainly the extant information, which is substantive, is very important to bring into the process. And Stephen, you make that point very, very well, and that would be my point also, is that the FERC licensing has provided a plethora of really good data, and it's the kind of data that Sarah Yarnell has mined to actually come up with some of these important relationships between flow recession and the needs of certain species during that time in the hydrograph. And that's kind of a blending of some of the concepts from those two methods, and that's what we mean by a hybrid. We don't mean that you take a little piece of this and a little piece of that. You actually blend together some of the stronger parts of each of those, and then you work within whatever system you're studying. And again, we do highly recommend a multi-species approach, and we do highly recommend that information on the hydrograph be carefully analyzed, put into a climate perspective, put into a geomorphology perspective, and put it into a geographic perspective. So those are some of the things that our report tries to communicate, and
right.
If it's not completely clear, we'd be more than happy to try to clarify, but I think it wasn't really throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of approach.
It wasn't wholesale substitution tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, that's what I thought.
Okay.
Okay. Great, but you're sticking around because we'll probably have more questions, if you can. Just wave at me when you have to go so that I know, and then we can do all of our final questions.
I'm here all morning.
Terrific. Thank you. All right, next, Tom Gehring with the Water Forum. Good to see you.
Thank you.
And just to remind our audience, this is the second of the two longer presentations before we get to public comment.
Good morning, thanks. Good morning, thanks very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here today because I am very proud of the work that we've done on the American River to develop a sustainable flow regime. And I know that when I get excited, sometimes I talk fast. I also know that I'm trying to cram a whole bunch of slides into 15 minutes, so I'm going to flash through some. And let me start by saying, so I read the Delta Science Programs report with a lot of interest, and my reaction as I went through it was, yeah, we did that. Yeah, we did that. Yeah, we did that. And so I'm going to talk about some of our consistency with that framework in what we've done. But I think the more important issue for this presentation is that we've been at this task for a couple of decades, and we've spent a lot of money, and we've spent a lot of time and a lot of mental energy on coming up with something that works for this stream that we love right here in our backyard. And in reading the report, it reminded me that we've been on the road so long that we sometimes forget how we got here. and we tend to talk about, look at this great thing we have. And the report reminded me that there is a need to go back and talk about the process and the technical underpinnings. So with that, I am talking about the Lower American River. And so you guys can see that, good. And it's a 23-mile, whoops. It is a 23-mile stretch of stream, downstream of Nimbus Dam to the confluence with the Sacramento. The watershed of the American River is those counties, all are part of those counties. It includes those cities and some unincorporated communities. And when I talk about we, the Water Forum, I'm talking about a very diverse group of folks who often don't agree on some very foundational issues, but they have come together and agreed on something called the Water Forum Agreement. It is dedicated to two co-equal objectives, a reliable...
I'm sorry, Tom, we're interrupting you. We want that animation. Is that something once we have your slides
dedicated
lift
staff?
and
Is
change?
this you will share this with all and
Yeah, I need it for
We'll
Friday.
have it and we'll steal it. Thank you very much. If we have trouble with it, we're calling you.
Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. Two co-equal objectives, reliable water supply for the region and protecting the Lower American River. And as part of that agreement, all of those diverse stakeholders agreed to develop an improved flow standard for the Lower American River. When I talk about the water half of our coalition, this is the way they view the region. To them, it's a water supply schematic. The Enviro members of our coalition, this is the way they view the region. To them, it's a stream. It's a living stream. It's protected by the state and federal Scenic Rivers Acts. It is something that needs to be sustained. And so, some words about the stream and our watershed. We exist in a highly altered stream, a highly altered state. This is a slide many of you have probably seen before. It basically says we used to have many miles of salmonid habitat, and we don't anymore. In fact, we used to have over 120 miles of habitat. Now we have a little over 20. But it's more than just the quantity, it's the quality. The previous habitat, beautiful mountain streams, over summering. They got to live their life cycle, parts of their life cycle, up there in that beautiful place. Now they need to exist on the hot valley floor. And that's a really important foundation of our flow standard, is recognizing this. One last sort of background slide. When we look at a flow standard in this region, we have the luxury of not having to drastically reallocate water from one use to another, because for the most part, it's a flow-in, flow-out watershed. The Folsom Reservoir is relatively small, and this graph shows you that the demand portion is a relatively small piece. Does that mean that we're ignoring the demand portion? Absolutely not. And in fact, if you look out there in that 2008 to 2013 period, you see that total demand in the region has actually gone down in recent history. So, when one talks about a flow regime, and this is from POF, one talks about turning knobs related to flow, things like, as Dr. Dom mentioned, magnitude, flow, duration, timing, to influence primary regulators of integrity and ultimately influence overall ecological integrity. And that's the approach we've taken. But in a highly altered environment like ours, we've recognized that we can't get to a sustainable aquatic ecosystem with just that knob. I am going to talk about this knob today, the flow manipulation knob, but I really want to point out that the next knob down, selective cold water releases, is an integral part of our flow standard. Let me just say a couple of quick slides about those other things, because those other non-flow things, because they are things that this region is investing in. The folks in this region have committed to investing about $15 million in habitat management and ecosystem restoration over the life of the agreement. We sometimes get a little press on those things. You may have seen some of our gravel projects on the Lower American River. We have an agreement that requires our water users to cut back their water use in dry years when the river is at its most sensitive condition. And at the most dry year, they would cut back to roughly their 1995 level of demand. We've been pursuing water conservation. We still have plenty of more work to do, but I am happy to report that in the last independent report we did on water conservation, we have seen over the last decade our per capita water use drop by about 20%. And yes, we have more to go. And part of that is because we have more meters to install. We're actively pursuing groundwater management. There are local governance structures. We have identified sustainable yield values. And we've been pursuing other things like eco-friendly landscaping. This is a website I'm particularly proud of. We funded this, and it was just launched recently. This is like the Sunset Western Garden book applied to eco-friendly landscaping applied to this region. And so reducing water use, reducing runoff, reducing the pollution load in the runoff. And finally, we are putting a great deal of energy into upgrading the temperature management hardware that helps control the thermal condition in the Lower American River. So, what are our river-specific ecological goals? Well, there they are. They are to sustain an aquatic ecosystem, to restore and enhance natural processes, and to reduce stressors. And I won't read them, but what you'll see if you skim that list of sub-bullets is they are all related to our salmonids. Why? So I'm going to go through now a step-by-step comparison. Some of these I'll go through really quickly. In essence, again, I think when we go through their, the panel's 7-step process, it's pretty much check, check, check. I may have misunderstood the extrapolation process, but I'll address that in a minute. So I'm going to try to do these quickly. Stream segment classification, yes, absolutely. And we didn't have to classify the stream itself because we're dealing with one stream. We have classified our streams into reaches. They tend to be a pool riffle type of approach. Step 2, hydrologic analyses, you bet. We've been at this for a couple of decades. We have models, we have temperature models, we have flow models, we have PHAB sim analyses, et cetera. Site-specific field work, we've done it and we're doing it. We have probably a field crew out on the river right now. And I am, with a lot of ecological programs, when times get, times get tough, the first thing that gets cut is the monitoring budget. I'm really pleased that we've been able to really stay whole on that here in our stream. Step 4, extrapolation. So as I read the report, I thought I understood that extrapolation meant from the landscape scale to a stream-based scale, but I heard Dr. Dom say that one component, and so in that regard, yeah, we haven't done that, because we started with a stream-specific approach. I thought I heard Dr. Dom this morning say part of extrapolation is to begin to extrapolate flow biology relationships, and we have done that, and I'll actually get to that in step 5. So step 5, I have several slides on this because this gets to the heart of the flow regime that we've developed. The hybrid approach said, think about processes like temperature, sediment management, sediment transport. Think about species. Well, we've done that. Again, we're looking at our 2 salmonid species. We have fall run, we have steelhead, and we're looking at processes. A lot of focus on temperature, but we're also looking at delta water quality, sediment transport, et cetera, et cetera. Why steelhead? I think we all know this. They're not doing well. They're listed. Population in the American River has dropped precipitously in the last decades. Why fall run Chinook salmon? This is a different variant of the slide that the last speaker showed, and although it does show that there is a cyclical nature to their population, what worries ecologists is that when we get into a valley of the population, the valley tends to get lower and lower every time we hit one. So we're worried about fall run. This is this is the nexus between flow and habitat. This is not the end-all be-all of our approach, but it is an important component. This graphs flow on the Lower American River versus percent of maximum spawning habitat. And what you see, a couple things I'll point out, is there is a sweet spot in the curve. The red one's steelhead, the blue one is for fall run. There's a sweet spot right around 2,000 CFS. So one important takeaway is, on the Lower American River, for these life stages, not all the time, but for these life stages, which occur at 2 different times of the year, more water's not always better. We've recognized that zone, and we've developed our flow regime so that most of the time, the great preponderance of the time, we're able to keep flows in that zone, in a zone that achieves 80% of the spawning rearing habitat values. So it's all about staying in a zone. How do we do that? We do that through specifying minimum flows. And we have an inherently adaptive approach that selects a different minimum depending on how much, on what type of water year it is, essentially. There are different relationships of this water, of hydrology versus minimum flow for different times of the year. And obviously in different years, then you pick a different value. It's important to note that we specify a minimum, not a maximum. So when reclamation operates Folsom Dam, they can operate above the minimum. This slide shows this is real information from last year, most of last year. And our minimum specified flow is the blue line. The actual release is the red line. First of all, notice the variability. Variability is an important thing for a flow regime. Also notice that reclamation didn't operate at the minimum until the fall. They operated close to the minimum parts of the year, but there are other times of the year, like June and July. This is what the science panel would call a flow block. This is a flow block about, as you can see in the very tiny note above that June-July period, that was for meeting Delta water quality standards. So the flow standard specifies the minimum, helps keep us in that optimal range for habitat, but allows for the other flow blocks, which sometimes overlap one another. I need to say a few words about water temperature. On the lower American River, it's too warm for a healthy salmonid habitat sometimes. Even in wet years like 2005, 2006, sometimes it's too warm. In a dry year like 2008, it's often too warm. So our flow standard deals with temperature management a lot. How do we do that? We do that by developing a new temperature plan, a new temperature target every spring. It's done using some fairly sophisticated temperature models. It seeks the best possible temperature by changing when and how you manipulate the temperature control device that hangs on the dam. Since the 2009 BIOP, NIMS now has to approve that plan. It is scrutinized by stakeholders. Ultimately, it requires some really good technical tools and analysis. And, but, as I mentioned, the current temperature plan has one knob, and that's the temperature shutters. Reclamation has been implementing this flow regime and this shutter-based temperature plan since 2006. Since that time, we've been looking at a different way to skin the cat. This is about flow manipulation. Lower graph is a hydrograph.
Sports metaphors, please.
This is are we on the first 1 yard line? Are we? No cat skinning, I gotcha. Thank you. The lower graph is a hydrograph. The upper graph is a thermograph. What our modeling shows is through relatively modest changes in the hydrograph, we can get a much better temperature result in some years. You see there in 1959, this is model data, right? And in a 1959 type of year, a wonderful temperature result in a relatively small flow manipulation. 1966, really good result. The other years, not so much. That's something we have been calling the modified flow pattern. Then, and we've been working on that for a year or so, then this year hit. And you like that one too? Thank you. And the drought opened our eyes to a couple of things. And as a result, we're basically taking a bit of a step back, and we're now working on a slightly different approach. We actually hope to merge these two, the modified approach, the carryover storage approach. In essence, from an ecological standpoint, we're looking at some relaxation of ecosystem protection in several years, in above average and wetter years, so that we can keep an insurance policy of water behind Folsom Dam and guard against the fairly catastrophic impacts of a year like 2014. And we have a lot of work to do. We think it is We think it is a really great idea. We haven't figured out quite how to do it. As we look into this, we have to look at unintended consequences to the delta, to the Sacramento River, right? And that's a big part of our challenge. As I mentioned, this is in response partly to the drought, but it's also the fact that we've observed something in our watershed. This is a 50-year trace of storage in Folsom Reservoir, and you can see two points, one in the 90s, one in the 70s, where the storage got really low. But what you also can notice, that's basically a half full line in the yellow. Since the drought of the 90s, Folsom has been exercised in a way that draws it down deeper more frequently. That tells us that our carryover storage idea, well, they did it before. They were carrying over more before. Maybe we can do that again. So it gives us some it gives us some assurance. Finishing up with our regime, I've talked about salmonid habitat, I've talked about water temperature. We've also addressed things like sediment transport, pulse flows, et cetera. I'm not going to go into those today in the interest of time. Would love to have an opportunity to come back with either you and the staff to get deeper into them. I also do want to mention, though, we have a couple of additional protections built into this regime. One is a protection for ramping rates. Another is actually a ramping up scheme that helps avoid red superimposition. I see some nods. And we also have a process built into the standard that calls for something we call the Water Forum Dry Year Conference in a year like this one. And I'm happy to say that we have put that to really good use this year. It's been very gratifying as the facilitator of this diverse group of folks to see them sitting down on almost a bi-weekly basis, comparing notes on how we're going to get through this year. One of the things, we can't take direct credit for this, Reclamation and NIMS and Fish and Wildlife take the real credit for this, but I can say that the Water Forum Conference process helped inform a real management action that took place 2 weeks ago, and that was a pulse flow on the Lower American River. It was a relatively small pulse, and because we have funding for monitoring, we have collected data that indicate that the pulse did its job. It helped stranded fry emerge from the gravel, and it helped begin outmigration. It's like, yes. Step 6 is about stakeholder interaction. We have basically had a continuous stakeholder process. Sometimes that's slow, sometimes it's really expensive, sometimes it's contentious. I would say I would sort of pool our stakeholder interactions into 3 pieces. One is a science team. We do have a team of scientists. I call them the ologists, really learned people who could give a much more scientifically informed description of what we're doing than I'm doing. And we also work very closely with Reclamation and our resource agencies. And as I mentioned before, one sort of ratification of that cooperation is that NIMS directly referenced and directly attached our flow standard as an RPA in the 2009 BIOP. Interaction between stakeholders. Yeah, that's sort of what my job is. It's these 4 diverse caucuses. Well, who are they? They're about 40 different organizations, very different corporate cultures, very different objectives, and yet they work together. All those folks come together periodically as needed. They also come together basically once a month, more frequently in 2014, in an interaction called the American River Group. This is a group that is unique to the American River. You've probably heard about the temperature group on the Sacramento. This is a temperature, flow, operations, power ecosystem group that meets once a month, convened by Reclamation. Resource agencies are there, our stakeholders are there, the Water Forum's there, and they literally compare notes and share information that become the basis for the operational decisions on this stream. Step 7, adaptive management. Yeah, we got that. And I would group our adaptive management opportunities into sort of 2 teams. Wait, 2, I'm trying to do sport. I'm sorry, I can't do it. 2 flavors. One is inherent year-to-year adaptive management. Because our minimum flow approach is a sliding scale that is dependent on existing hydrology, there's an inherent adaptive mechanism there. And it not only responds to year-by-year changes in hydrology, ultimately responds to climate change as well. Same with our temperature approach. We reset that temperature target every year based on the amount of cold water sitting behind the dam in May, how much snowpack is up in the Sierra. The other flavor of adaptive management is on a much broader time scale. It's more of your classic adaptive management, set hypotheses, collect data, test hypotheses, lessons learned, make changes. And what more can I say other than it's built into the American River Group's approach. It's the driver for the monitoring that we do. I guess the other thing that I can say is that the new path we're treading down on a modified approach and a carryover storage approach is frankly a result of adaptive management. In 2006, when we published this thing, got it. And in the years since, we said, we can reach the goal line in a different play. No, yeah, okay. I'm trying on this, okay. In conclusion, I think we've met all of them. Depending on my interpretation of extrapolation, we either have or haven't. Next steps. We've been working with your staff. We hope to continue to do that. We are updating some of our models. You know, the model baseline issue when you're doing a long-term project is such a bugaboo. So you have to just keep updating them. We have to sort of finish walking the walk on this carryover storage option. I'm very optimistic. We have an EIR that we're working on. Hopefully we'll have that out in 2014. But I did say the same thing in 2013 about that document. And then, long-term implementation. Reclamation is implementing the 2006 version of that now. And as we make changes, our intent is that we would continue implementing those. Staff asked me to say a few words about the ideal ecological flow. Do I have time for that?
Yeah, it's important to the discussion today, but I just wanted to remind you you've gone over. It was great.
I'm happy to stop.
No, don't. I want to know what this slide is. You see, you save
What a
those best
tease.
ones for last,
What a
right? That's
tease.
pretty clever. I think go ahead.
When I think about an idealized flow for the Lower American River, I would start with these factors. They should look familiar. They kind of look like Dr. Dom's slide. And I would begin working on those, and I would be thinking about the two species of concern. Because it is such an altered system, because we are propagating a cold water fishery on the warm valley floor, I believe we would end up with the flow standard we have now as the ideal biological flow standard. We did it. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely, and that's what adaptive management is about. But we have a beautiful stream out there. It is the jewel of the Sacramento region. It has a wonderful fishery already, and our intent is to continue with the protections we've put in place and make them better, and try to keep those two fisheries and the integral environment sustainable for future generations. So, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. I mean, I've been a fan of the Water Forum since the 90s as I watched you guys doing it, and it is good to hear. It's that combination of trying to focus on the science but also spending as much time on the people in the room, the thing I always call the ecosystem management of it, not the ecosystem management. It only really works when you can do both well. And so very, very
and
helpful, and I appreciate it. It's messy and it's time consuming, and it's not just a notice and comment period. It's a much more engaged, real relationship of people, and you can see in what you've put together. You know, I can even envision what some of the conversations and the cross-training and the acknowledgement and appreciation of different needs and views and values that you managed in this community to pull together. I'm sure there's been a lot of strain and stress and arguments and all of that during the time, but that over time you've maintained that we're all in this together linkage, let's talk it through, is pretty impressive.
Yeah,
So
you know, I have this gray hair and I'm only 25.
that's right. All right, let's turn it to questions. I'll start on this side this time.
I don't have anything specific. I'm just very impressed, and I'll just appreciate the homework you did to tie what you're doing to the science panel's recommendations.
I appreciate that. And as I mentioned, it was a good exercise for us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. I think we could look at all those tributaries on staff's slide and think about what's already being done and how it matches up with the science panel's recommendations. So thank you for walking us through that. It was very constructive.
Pleasure.
I'll just add my thanks as well. That was very, very informative, and the graphics are wonderful,
It was fun.
and the animation is
I-
great too.
Yes, I should have been a cartoonist
Yeah.
instead of a, yeah.
That's great.
I only have one, and we go way, way back on conservation, water recycling, other forms of wet water, are creating wet water in a stream. And while carryover storage, I totally get that, for all the things that you had there, but nobody seemed to be going back to revisit the 2025 deadline for metering. You mentioned meters, but last night I had a conversation with several people who live in this area, and they had put meters, temporary meters, in their backyards that help them monitor what they are doing in anticipation at some point of the front, street level bigger meters that the city's going after. And they said it was cost effective because they were able to save $600 over some period of, and of course water use was down. So,
Yeah.
how do you make that part of the methodology here?
I just hope the creators of Nest were listening. It's a whole new market for them.
Good.
It's part of the fabric, the fabric of what we're doing. First of all, this region will meet the 2025 deadline
I'm sure of
for
that.
fully meeting.
Okay.
And then, of course, billing comes, a year after that. There's a reason why our per capita water use has gone down. Several reasons. One is, I think, the locals' water conservation programs. A lot of it, I think, is metering. Some of it is density changes. As more growth happens, we tend to build denser houses. It has a lower landscaping demand. Some of the recent downtrend may also be part of the economic downturn, and so there's a real worry about a rebound in that per capita, right? I guess the other thing I'd say is although many people really grumbled, I think SB 7X7 was a bit of a game changer, at least for this region. Many of the water district general managers that I work with on a day-to-day basis, almost overnight, went from, what do I have to do to comply with the BMPs, to how in the world do I get my per capita down? That may sound like a subtle shift, but that is a huge shift. And I'm going to get a little beat up for saying these comments in this forum, but it made a difference. It changed the focus, and we have more work to do, but I think it's getting done.
Well, at your next monthly meeting, bring up the issue of interim steps. 2025 is over 10 years away, and are there things that can be done that go directly to creating more capacity for carryover storage in your dams? I mean, it's to me the link is tight,
Mm-hmm.
and so have that discussion.
You bet. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for joining us and for all the work that you and your colleagues have done these many years. All right. We're now going to move to public comment. And first we have Li Ming He from NOAA Fisheries.
Thank you, board members. My name is Li Ming He. I work
He,
for
sorry.
NOAA Fisheries.
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
No, I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name. I pronounced it the way I was taught to say that word. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you are right.
That's
Li
the
Ming
second
He.
time that's happened to me.
Yeah.
You can tell, this is where my Chinese studies major in college comes in.
But in United States,
Yeah.
my last name is He. Yeah.
Thank you. Got it.
Okay, thank you. I work for NOAA Fisheries in Sacramento. I'm a hydrologist and a project manager for water operations and Delta Consultation Branch. Today I'm here to support the method. I have 3 points. 2 points is to support, and the third one is a recommendation. So first point, we support for developing tributary flow criteria. Tributary flows are critical for salmonid species because they spend 1/3 to 1/2 of their lifetime and experience the most sensitive life stages in upstream watersheds. While it appeared to be focusing more on the delta than upstream tributaries, we emphasize that both of them, upstream tributaries and delta, are critical to the survival and recovery of the listed species in the Central Valley. So I applaud your effort to work on upstream tributary flow. Second, we support for the recommended method for developing in-stream flow criteria. It is based upon the generally recognized and well-accepted natural flow paradigm and integrates with specific field studies if they are available. For the past 4 years, we have been working on in-stream flows for listed salmonid species in the Central Valley. The scientific foundation of our methodology is very much similar to what Dr. Dam has already described and reported in the report. Lastly, we recommend the flows needed for sustaining water temperature be considered as part of the in-stream flow development. Water temperatures in tributaries are often too high for spawning and rearing in summer and fall, especially those 2 seasons for spawning and rearing. So adequate flows are needed to maintain suitable water temperature for spawning and rearing. In tributaries, we recommend that State Water Board consider water temperature issues in developing tributary flows. Thank you.
Great. Questions or comments? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll continue to be talking with you.
Great.
Scott Cantrell from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. There you are. It's not, use the taller one. Yeah, because that you can adjust that one more easily.
Okay, how's that?
That's better. Move it up, and then you don't have to bend over.
How's that?
Fabulous.
Perfect.
Yes.
Great. My name is Scott Cantrell. I'm the chief of the water branch in the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I first of all want to thank the Water Board for convening this workshop. I think it was a very good idea, and it's very useful. And I also want to thank the Delta Science Program, and in particular Dr. Cliff Dahm, for his very thoughtful report that he developed in collaboration with the other scientists that reviewed the information. We believe the Delta Science Program always brings great value to these types of discussions, along with the ISB also. They're very useful. So our initial read of the report is that we're still in the process of evaluating it, but we think it's going to be very instructive as we move ahead. and that, I just wanted to, I think there's some things worth calling out in the report that I want to bring to your attention that we strongly agree with. And one is, we thought it was very useful that they identified explicitly that there are strengths and weaknesses and uncertainties associated both with the IFIM and Aloha methods, and that both methods may require collection of site-specific data and information, and that it's the notion to suggest or infer that the PMM and Aloha are fundamentally different frameworks creates, in our view, a false dichotomy. We totally agree with that. And the report also says, in short, both approaches are fairly similar in their data needs and analyses, and they recommend that we draw the best from both approaches and use them in the Phase 4 process. We think those are all really great points. And we also, a point that resonated with us strongly is that the report stated that successful implementation of flow standards will largely rest on societal challenges rather than challenges associated with a more scientific nature. And, getting at the issue that, there needs to be, we're dealing with scarce resources and competing uses for water, and that's going to be your guys' job of doing the balancing after we move through this whole process, multi-phase process. And we also strongly agree that, as stated in the report, that interaction between scientists, stakeholders, and decision makers throughout this process, i.e. public engagement, is going to be very critical, and that we in the department are ramping up our thoughts about how to engage the public for the studies that we are planning to conduct and have a more structured, formalized process, just decision process of how and when and to what extent to involve stakeholders. And we thought it was worth noting, in Dr. Dumb's PowerPoint, he had a bullet there that said that diminished flows are the primary predictors of biological integrity for fish and wildlife resources. And he elaborated on what constitutes a flow regime, the flow, the magnitude, the duration, the timing, the recession. We think that that's important to call out, because we in the department also feel that there's substantial evidence that flow is a key determinant of ecological processes and species viability. So I thought that was very good. It's a determinant. It's not the only factor. There are other factors that influence populations and ecological processes, but absent flow, you're not going to move sediment or reform channels or inundate floodplain. The water needs to be there.
So if you were going to edit Ms. Kincaid's chart, you would keep all those other things, but you might make the flow box a little bigger?
I'd make the box a little bigger.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Or connected, little diagram.
in conclusion,
Right.
the department is very happy to assist the Water Board in developing the Phase 4 strategy document this fall. And the department's also committed to implementing a transparent process that will ensure successful outcomes. We recognize that we have to bring a perspective of pragmatism to this whole process, given the cost and benefits of doing the Cadillac version intensive IFIM versus an alternative method. And again, we think it's a false dichotomy. So we strongly agree with the Delta Science Panel report that we need to figure out how to adopt the key points and benefits of both approaches. And I think in terms of next steps, in the next couple, 3 weeks, the department, along with the Fish and Wildlife Service and NEMS, we're going to sit down with, among the 3 fish agencies and with the water board staff and discuss what the next steps are and see how can we implement the recommendations and advice that are specified in the report and collaborate to develop integrated work plans for conducting whatever hybrid approach that we come up with to help the water board achieve its requirements under the Delta Plan and state law.
Great. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
And for all the work to come.
Yes.
Questions or comments?
I just want to thank the department. I appreciate your remarks and your support and helping us through this process, you know, and recognize all your efforts to date, and just appreciate all staff from the agencies working with our staff. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
Thanks
you.
very much. And last but definitely not least, Debbie Webster from the Central Valley Clean Water Association.
Thank you, Chair Marcus and board members, and I apologize because I know you really want to hit the technical, and I'm going to at least talk more about the implementation, because as you were talking earlier about reaching out to stakeholders and who's going to be affected, it is not always obvious who is, and as a POTW, we don't normally take water from a river system. We normally are putting in if we're a surface water discharger. But if we've been putting in and then we decide to recycle water, we then take it out. And so because you're looking at implementing these through water quality objectives, unless the implementation plan specifically doesn't include POTWs, we would then have this implemented on permits. And so this becomes really important to us, and I do want to just let you know, and with that in your outreach, or the outreach that's going to happen through this, the more that you can identify that and who might be impacted, the better the process is going to get. And so on the science, we'll take a look at it. It'll be a little bit hard not knowing how we're going to be impacted and whether or not we need to be included, because although we are not a beneficial use, we deal with the results of being a beneficial use. And we are an important factor when you look at the Water Code 13,000 as the uses of those waters and how they're used. And so I do ask that you take a look at that, and I'm looking forward to this process and really want to give my kudos to this morning's presentations by your staff and Cliff Dom too. It was very informative, so thank you.
Thanks for getting that on the radar. I think you're going to end up being involved in more and more of this side of the house. And I remember when Fran was there as well in LA, when people would posit, wow, if you start recycling all this water, you're going to take it out of the streams, and aren't you worried about that? And I said, the day that's my problem, I'm going to be a happy girl, because that means we're recycling more water. And this was, what, more than 20 years ago, when I had the first microphone in my face asking that question down just in Los Angeles and talking about the LA River. But you're absolutely right that this, especially as we focus on really doing what we need to do to make use of each of those water molecules more carefully over and over again as we recycle water, in many cases it is the lifeblood of a living stream, and I think we're going to be having to figure out how we talk about beneficial uses and uses of that water. It's going to be, it's complex, but it's a conversation that I hope we keep having to have. So, thanks.
I just want to echo, thank you for bringing this up. And this was an illustration of my earlier comment, which is as we develop policies, we do our job best when we do a good job of communicating what the implementation will be and the implications for compliance with specific permits. So yes, MPDS permits will have to comply with any kind of objectives from a strict regulatory standpoint. And so it's important for us to chart that course keeping in mind all the beneficial uses that we're going to balance in the equation. So, and of course, Chair Marcus did a great job illustrating that with that story. It's a problem we want to have. Well, yeah, it's a problem we've always had, and now we've got to really manage it. Thanks very much.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. All of those presentations and comments were helpful in the context of what we're doing and what we need to do. I appreciate that. I'm kind of surprised no NGOs came on this one. I know you put it all out on your list, but I'm sort of surprised. They may just all be at that budget hearing I saw everybody going to when we were all in the parking garage this morning.
There's a lot going on, but
Yeah.
also remember that our comment period is not yet closed, so we anticipate a lot more interest and comment coming in.
Terrific. And maybe people are listening online because they're so busy, and this workshop will have informed what they'll submit to us next month. So that is great. So I thank you all for your time and all your hard work, and we'll be seeing you again. You know that.